The first thing Eleanora Whitfield noticed about the new groundsman was that he never looked at her the way the others did. Not with pity, not with the polite, practiced indifference the servants at Ashcombe Hall reserved for a poor relation who had outstayed her welcome. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying very hard not to be curious about, and failing. She had been at Ashcombe for 11 months, ever since her father's debts had swallowed the last of their modest house in Hertfordshire, and her aunt, Lady Prescott, had taken her in with the particular cruelty of someone who wanted credit for charity without ever performing its warmth. Eleanora mended linens. She read to her aunt's spaniel when no one else would. She wore her cousin Charlotte's gowns after Charlotte had tired of them, let out at the seams, the colour always slightly wrong for her, the hem always an inch too short, because Charlotte was 3 inches taller and had never once considered that difference before handing something down. She had learned, in those 11 months, how to make herself small, how to enter a room without disturbing its air, how to be useful enough to keep her place, and unremarkable enough that no one questioned why she still had one. And then, on a grey Tuesday in early autumn, a new man arrived to tend the west gardens, and something in the ordinary rhythm of the house shifted, though she could not have said how. His name, they told her, was Nathaniel Hart. Quiet, capable, kept to himself. He had come with excellent references from a household in the north, though no one seemed to remember exactly which one, and he handled the pruning shears with the careful attention of a man who had once done very different work with his hands. Eleanora thought nothing of him for the first week. She had trained herself not to think of anyone too long. Thinking led to wanting, and wanting had never once been safe for her. But then came the afternoon with the rose trellis. She had gone out to the kitchen garden to gather mint for her aunt's tisane, moving quickly, because Charlotte's old shawl did little against the wind, and she had not seen the loose stone until her foot caught it. She stumbled, the basket flying from her hands, and would have gone down hard against the gravel path if a pair of steady arms had not caught her at the elbow. "Careful," he said. Just that. His voice was low, unhurried, with an edge of something she could not place. Not the flat vowels of a Hertfordshire groundsman. Not quite. "The path is treacherous there. I have been meaning to have it seen to." She looked up into a face that was, she would later admit to herself, entirely too finely made for a man who spent his days digging in the dirt. Dark eyes, a jaw that spoke of discipline rather than labor. Hands that had caught her firmly but let her go the instant she was steady, as though he were careful never to hold what was not offered. "Thank you," she said, gathering the scattered mint with hands that trembled slightly, though she told herself it was only the fall. "I ought to watch where I walk." "You ought to be watched over," he said, and then seemed almost startled by his own words, as though they had escaped some private thought he had not meant to speak aloud. He busied himself immediately with retrieving her basket, refilling it with more mint than she had dropped, and did not meet her eyes again before she left. She thought about that sentence for 3 days. It was foolish. She knew it was foolish. A groundsman's idle courtesy was not a thing to turn over in one's mind like a coin one could not stop spending. But there had been something in the way he'd said it. Not flirtation, not the careless flattery she'd occasionally suffered from footmen who thought a poor relation an easy target for a stolen kiss. It had sounded like an observation, like a fact he had noted and regretted revealing. Why would a groundsman speak to her as though her safety were his particular concern? She did not have an answer, and so she did what she had trained herself to do with all unanswerable things. She folded it away and went back to her mending. But he was there again the next week, and the week after that, always at the periphery of her days, repairing the very stone that had tripped her, appearing with an extra lantern on the evening she was sent to fetch preserves from the cold cellar after dark, materializing near the stable, the afternoon Charlotte's gelding threw a shoe, and Eleanora, of all the family, was the only one who went to check on the frightened animal, instead of complaining about the delay. "You are not afraid of him," Nathaniel said that day, watching her run a soothing hand down the gelding's trembling neck, while the animal calmed under her low, steady voice. "He is only frightened. Eleanora said. "Fear is not the same as danger. Most creatures only want to be understood." Nathaniel went very still at that. She did not see the particular weight in his expression because she was not looking at him. She was looking at the horse, the way she always looked at things that needed looking at, rather than things that might look back with interest. But if she had turned, she would have seen a man studying her as though she had just handed him the answer to a question he had carried a very long way. There were other small moments in the weeks that followed, moments Eleanora did not allow herself to examine too closely at the time, though she would return to each of them later with the particular clarity that only comes after the truth has finally been revealed. There was the morning she came down before dawn to steal a quiet hour with a book in the cold library, only to find the fire already lit, though no housemaid had yet stirred, and no explanation offered for it beyond a groundsman's quiet appearance at the window some minutes later, secateurs in hand, as though he had simply happened to be passing. There was the afternoon Charlotte, in one of her more careless cruelties, had ordered Eleanora to walk 3 miles into the village and back to fetch a particular ribbon that could easily have waited for the following day's errand. And Eleanora had returned to find the distance somehow shortened by a borrowed pony cart left conveniently at the crossroads, with no note, no explanation, and a groundsman who claimed, when pressed, only to have noticed the cart standing idle and thought it a shame to let it go unused. There was the evening she had wept, quietly, uselessly, in the walled kitchen garden where she believed no one could hear her, over a letter from her father's former solicitor, confirming that the last of the family's modest inheritance had been swallowed entirely by debt, that there would be no dowry, no independence, no escape from Ashcombe Hall's charity ever, for as long as she lived. She had not known, weeping into her own folded hands among the cold cabbage rows, that a man stood just beyond the garden wall, utterly still, listening to every broken word of it, and that something in him had hardened into resolve long before she ever dried her eyes and composed herself to go back inside. He never mentioned that evening to her directly. But 3 days later, a small unsigned note appeared among her things, containing nothing but a single line of verse about the resilience of things that grow best in difficult soil, and she had turned it over in her hands for a long while, wondering who among the household staff could possibly have troubled themselves to leave it, before folding it carefully into the same trunk where she kept her mother's blue silk gown. She did not yet understand that she had been, for weeks, quietly and thoroughly seen by a man with every reason in the world to remain hidden, and every reason, increasingly, to abandon that hiding altogether. He did not tell her his name was not truly Nathaniel Hart. He did not tell her that 6 weeks earlier he had been called Crown Prince Alaric of Verranmore, third in line to a throne he did not particularly want, and that he had left his father's court in the dead of night with nothing but a satchel, a false name, and a bone-deep exhaustion with being seen only as a title and never as a man. He had wanted for once in his life to be looked at and judged for what his hands could do and what his character was worth, not for the weight of a crown that had not yet touched his head. He had not expected in a minor gentleman's household in rural England to find the one person in 100 who seemed to look past exactly the things everyone else looked for. The trouble was that Eleanora Whitfield was invisible to everyone who mattered, and increasingly, unbearably visible to him. The trouble, too, was Mr. Barrow. Mr. Edmund Barrow was a widowed gentleman of modest but respectable fortune, who had taken to calling at Ashcombe Hall with increasing regularity that autumn, ostensibly to pay court to Charlotte, though Lady Prescott had begun, with the particular calculation of a woman assessing every asset in her household, to wonder aloud whether a quieter, more biddable niece might not make him a steadier wife than her own restless daughter. "He has said nothing of the kind," Eleanora told her aunt flatly, the first time the suggestion was floated over breakfast, as though Eleanora herself were a parcel of land to be redirected to a more convenient buyer. "Nor would I welcome it if he had. You are 23, Eleanora, with no dowry and no prospects," Lady Prescott said, not unkindly, exactly, but with the brisk practicality of a woman who had long since stopped pretending that sentiment governed such decisions. "Mr. Barrow is 50, but he is comfortable, and he has already buried one wife who gave him no trouble. You would do well to consider that some women are not permitted to wait for a grand romance. Some women are permitted only to be sensible." Eleanora had said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say that would not be met with the same brittle practicality. But she had felt, for the first time in months, a genuine cold dread settle into her chest. Not merely the ache of being overlooked, but the sharper fear of being disposed of, handed off to a widower twice her age, simply because it was convenient for someone else's household arithmetic. Nathaniel, she still thought of him only as Nathaniel then, had seemed to sense the shift in her almost before she understood it herself. She found him, some days later, mending a section of fence near the eastern paddock, and though she had said nothing of Mr. Barrow, he seemed to have gathered the whole of it from whatever quiet channels ran beneath the surface of the household. "You looked as though the whole of Hertfordshire had settled its weight upon your shoulders this morning," he said, not looking up from his work, giving her the particular courtesy of not forcing her to meet his eyes while she decided whether to answer honestly. "My aunt has plans for me," Eleanora said, surprising herself with how readily the words came when she had told almost no one else the whole of her fears. Sensible plans. A widower with a comfortable income and very little interest, I imagine, in anything I might actually think or feel. Nathaniel's hands had gone still on the fence rail, though his voice, when it came, remained carefully even. "And is that a fate you would choose for yourself, if the choosing were truly yours?" "The choosing has never truly been mine," she said, and there was no self-pity in it, only the plain accounting of a life she had long since stopped expecting to arrange to her own liking. "I have learned to be grateful for whatever safety is offered, Mr. Hart, rather than to ask whether it is also happiness." "That," he said quietly, turning to look at her then with an intensity that startled her, "is the single most dispiriting sentence I have heard spoken in this county, and I have heard a great many dispiriting sentences since I arrived. You deserve considerably more than gratitude for scraps, Miss Whitfield. I hope, one day, to prove that to you rather than simply saying it." She had not known, walking away from that conversation with her heart beating strangely fast, that the man who had spoken those words held within his power the ability to remake her entire life should he choose to, and that he had, in that very moment, begun quietly and deliberately to choose exactly that. Mr. Barrow called again the following week and made polite, dull conversation with Charlotte in the drawing-room, while Eleanora sat in the corner with her mending, as she always did, and thought, with a fresh stab of dread, how easily this could become her whole future. Sitting always in some corner, mending always someone else's things, married eventually to convenience rather than to anything resembling love. It was that same evening, restless and unable to settle, that she went walking in the gardens after dark, farther than she ought, past the rose trellis and toward the old chapel ruin at the edge of the property that no one else in the household troubled to visit. And it was there, in the cold hush of broken stone and ivy, that she allowed herself, for the first time, to weep, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, exhausted grief of a woman who had spent 11 months holding herself together and found, for one unguarded hour, that she simply could not hold any longer. She did not know that Nathaniel had followed her at a careful distance, concerned by the pallor he'd seen in her face at dinner, and that he stood now just beyond the broken chapel archway, unwilling to intrude upon a grief so plainly private, and yet unable to make himself leave her to endure it entirely alone. He heard everything, the fear of Mr. Barrow, the ache of her mother's memory, worn thin now like the blue silk gown, the particular loneliness of being tolerated rather than wanted, in every room she had occupied since her father's death. He heard her whisper, to no one, that she sometimes wondered whether anyone would ever choose her for herself alone, rather than for the convenience of what she could be made to do or bear. He did not step forward that night. It was not yet his place, and he knew it. But he returned to his small quarters near the stables, with a resolve that had hardened past uncertainty into something closer to purpose, and he began, from that night forward, to make certain, in every quiet, unwitnessed way available to a man still hiding behind a borrowed name, that Eleanora Whitfield would never again believe herself unchosen. It was Charlotte, of course, who provided the first real threat to the fragile, wordless understanding growing between the groundsman and the poor cousin. Lady Prescott's ball was to be the event of the autumn season, an ambitious affair meant to secure Charlotte a match worthy of the family's straining finances, and every gown, every candle, every guest list decision had been made with that single purpose in mind. Eleanora had not expected to attend at all. Poor relations who mended linens did not typically appear at balls meant to catch a husband for someone else. But 3 days before the event, Charlotte's chosen gown, a confection of ivory silk and seed pearls that had taken the local seamstress 6 weeks to complete, was ruined. No one ever quite established how the wine came to be spilled across the bodice, though the housemaid who'd been carrying the tray wept for an hour afterward and swore it had been an accident of the worst luck. Charlotte, in a fury that shook the house, declared she would not attend her own ball in something borrowed and beneath her, and threatened to take to her bed with a headache rather than be seen in anything less than perfection. It was Lady Prescott, practical even in crisis, who solved the problem in the manner that cost her the least. "Eleanora has that blue thing," she said, waving a hand as though the matter were already settled. "The one from 2 seasons past. Let Charlotte wear it. The color suits her far better than it ever did you, and no one will remember it besides." The blue thing, as it happened, was the only gown Eleanora owned that had ever been made for her rather than handed down, a gift from her mother in the last year before her mother died, a soft cornflower silk that Eleanora had kept folded in tissue at the bottom of her trunk, worn only twice, because it was the only beautiful thing she still possessed that had not first belonged to someone else. She did not argue. Arguing was not a luxury poor relations were permitted. She fetched the gown herself and laid it across Charlotte's bed with hands that did not shake, because she had long ago learned that showing hurt only invited more of it. But Charlotte, trying the gown that evening, discovered what Eleanora already knew and had never mentioned, that her mother had made it a size too small for Charlotte's frame, gathered at the waist in a way that would not let out, no matter how the seamstress strained the seams, that very night, at the very last hour. "It cannot be worn," the seamstress finally admitted, exhausted. "Not by Miss Charlotte. Perhaps," she glanced, almost apologetically, at Eleanora, who stood silently in the corner, holding pins she had been asked to hold. "Perhaps it might do for Miss Whitfield instead, if a gown is needed to fill a chair at the table and keep the numbers even." And so it was decided, with all the warmth of an afterthought, that Eleanora would attend the ball after all, not as a guest worth inviting, but as a body worth seating, wearing the one dress in the house that had ever been made to fit her. She told herself she did not care how the invitation had come to her. She told herself, dressing that evening in a room that was not truly hers, in a house that had never truly wanted her, that she would keep to the edges as she always did, unremarkable and unbothered, and that this ball would pass like every other evening of her constrained little life. There had been, in the days before that final letter arrived, a growing unease among the household staff that Eleanora had noticed but not fully understood. Whispers among the footmen that the new groundsman kept strange hours, that he had been seen writing letters in a hand too fine for a labourer's, that a travelling merchant passing through the village had sworn he recognized something familiar in the set of the stranger's shoulders, though he could not say from where. Mrs. Kellow, the housekeeper, had voiced the suspicion most directly one evening in the servants' hall, within Eleanora's hearing, though not, she assumed, with any intention of being overheard by the family above. "There is something not right about that man," the housekeeper had said, folding linens with brisk, disapproving hands. "No groundsman I have ever known speaks the way he speaks, nor carries himself the way he carries himself when he thinks no one of consequence is watching. Mark my words, there is a story behind Mr. Hart, and I do not think it is one we shall like the ending of." Eleanora had said nothing, though the words had lodged themselves uncomfortably in her chest, because some small, unexamined part of her had already begun to suspect the same thing, without yet permitting herself to look at the suspicion directly. She had noticed, after all, the fineness of his hands for a man who claimed to have labored his whole life. She had noticed the particular authority in his stillness, the way even Ashcombe Hall's most dismissive footman deferred to him without quite understanding why. She had noticed, and had chosen, deliberately, not to ask, because some instinct told her that whatever answer she received might cost her something she was not yet prepared to lose. It was this same unease, growing quietly beneath the surface of her days, that made the arrival of the royal envoys at the ball feel less like a thunderclap and more like the final confirmation of a truth she had already half glimpsed and refused to name. She would understand, only much later, that her own reluctance to ask the obvious question had been its own quiet act of protection, not naivety, but a kind of grace, extended instinctively toward a man she sensed was carrying some private weight, long before she understood what that weight actually was. She did not know, fastening the last button at her wrist, that a man in the West Gardens had been informed only that morning that his father's envoys had finally traced him to Hertfordshire, and that he had perhaps 3 days left to decide whether he would return to Verranmore as its prince, or disappear entirely and become, forever, simply Nathaniel Hart. She did not know that he had already made his choice, 3 weeks ago, in a stable, watching a woman soothe a frightened horse with nothing but patience and a low, steady voice. Nor did she know that the letter which had arrived that same morning, sealed with a crest she did not recognize, and delivered by a rider who had not stopped at the front door, but had instead sought out the stables directly, had informed the man she knew as Nathaniel Hart that his father's health had taken a sudden, worsening turn, and that the kingdom of Verranmore could not, in good conscience, continue much longer without knowing where its wandering prince had gone. He had 3 days, the letter said, perhaps 4, if he wished to test his father's patience further. After that, men better resourced and considerably less discreet than the current envoys would be sent to find him, and the manner of his return would no longer be his to choose. He had read the letter twice in the grey stable light, and then had gone, without quite deciding to stand at the edge of the kitchen garden where he could watch, at a careful distance, Eleanora hanging linens in the thin autumn sun, her sleeves pushed back, a smear of flour still on her wrist from some earlier errand in the kitchens, entirely unaware that she was being looked at with the particular desperate tenderness of a man who has just been told his freedom is ending, and has decided, in that same breath, precisely what he intends to do with what remains of it. He would go to the ball, he decided. He would go as himself for the first time in 6 weeks, whatever the cost, because he found he could no longer stomach the thought of vanishing back into Verranmore's gilded formality without having told this one particular woman, plainly and completely, what she had come to mean to him. The seamstress's confession that the blue silk gown could not be let out to fit Charlotte's frame reached Eleanora's ears on the very afternoon of the ball itself, and she received the news with the same flat composure she had trained herself to bring to every fresh small humiliation the household offered her. She did not point out, though she might have, that she had known the gown would not fit Charlotte from the very first fitting, having sewn a hem herself the previous spring, and understood precisely how narrow her mother had cut the waist. She had simply held her tongue, as she always did, and let the discovery unfold in its own time, because pointing out other people's oversights had never once earned her anything but resentment for having noticed them. "Well," Lady Prescott said, surveying the ruined evening's careful arithmetic with visible irritation, "I suppose it cannot be helped. Eleanora, wear the blue thing yourself then, and sit quietly somewhere near the back. We shall need an even number at table regardless, and it is better than an empty chair." It was, Eleanora reflected, dressing in the borrowed light of a room that was not truly hers, precisely the sort of invitation she had come to expect from this house, not a welcome, but a convenience, not a wish to see her shine, but a reluctant admission that her presence, for once, happened to solve a numerical problem rather than create one. She fastened the small pearl buttons at her wrist with hands that did not shake, because she had long ago decided that showing hurt only ever invited more of it, and she told the mirror, quietly, that she expected nothing from this evening beyond its ending. She did not yet know that a man in the West Gardens, dressing in clothes considerably finer than any Nathaniel Hart had ever owned, was preparing, in that same hour, to end the careful anonymity of 6 entire weeks for no reason in the world except that he could not bear the thought of leaving Hertfordshire without her knowing, in full, exactly how thoroughly she had already been chosen. The ballroom at Ashcombe Hall had been transformed with more expense than the family could truly afford. Banks of hothouse flowers, mirrors angled to multiply the candlelight, an orchestra imported from Bath at a cost Lady Prescott would complain about for months afterward. Eleanora entered through a side door, as instructed, and found a chair near the wall where the family's poor relations were traditionally expected to remain, smiling politely, speaking to no one unless spoken to, existing at the very edge of an evening built entirely for someone else. She had grown skilled at this particular kind of disappearing. She watched Charlotte, resplendent in a rose-colored gown that had been finished in a desperate rush after the blue silk failed her, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her welcome anywhere. She watched the young men gather around her cousin like moths drawn to a well-lit window, and felt the old familiar ache of being the darkened pane beside it. She did not expect to be noticed. She had made a study, over 11 months, of not being noticed, which was precisely why it startled her so thoroughly when a voice at her shoulder said, quietly, "You look as though you are trying to become part of the wallpaper, Miss Whitfield. I confess I find the attempt unconvincing. The wallpaper is not nearly so interesting to look at." She turned and found herself looking not at the groundsman in his rough work clothes, but at a man transformed, dark evening coat cut with a precision no local tailor in Hertfordshire could have managed, a bearing that filled the space around him without any visible effort to do so, an unmistakable authority in his stillness that she had somehow, impossibly, failed to notice before, even as she had noticed everything else about him. "Mr. Hart," she said, though the name felt suddenly, strangely wrong in her mouth. "I did not expect to see me here," he finished for her. "No, I imagine you did not." Something moved behind his eyes, some private reckoning she could not follow. "There is a great deal about me you have not expected, Miss Whitfield, and I find myself in the uncomfortable position of owing you an explanation I am not yet permitted to give in full. Will you grant me the very great favor of a dance regardless, and trust that the explanation will come before the night's business is concluded?" Every rule of the house said she should refuse. A poor relation did not dance with mysterious gentlemen at her cousin's ball. A poor relation kept to her chair, smiled when required, and vanished quietly when the evening ended. But she found, looking into that steady, waiting face, that she did not want to keep to the rules that had shaped her whole small life. "Yes," she said, and gave him her hand. They danced, and the room seemed, for the length of it, to fall away entirely. He held her with a correctness that never once slipped into presumption, and yet there was something in the way his eyes stayed on her face. Not the room, not the other dancers, not the glittering crowd that included women in far finer gowns, that made her feel, for the first time in 11 months, entirely, unbearably seen. "You knew about the horse," she said quietly, as they turned. "You watched me with the gelding, and you did not say anything, but you were testing something. I felt it even then." "I was learning something," he corrected gently. "There is a difference. A test presumes I doubted you would pass." "I never doubted that, Miss Whitfield, not from the very first week." "Then what were you learning?" He was silent a long moment, his hand warm and steady at her waist, his gaze not once leaving hers. "Whether a person could exist," he said finally, "who was kind to what could not repay her kindness, who noticed what others overlooked, simply because it was right to notice it, with no thought of reward or witness. I had begun to believe such a person was a fiction invented by men who wished the world were gentler than it is. I did not expect to find her mending linens in a house that did not deserve her. She should have laughed it off as flattery. She should have reminded herself, as she had reminded herself so many times before, that pretty words from handsome men had a way of costing poor women a great deal more than they ever paid in return. But there was no flattery in his face. There was something closer to reverence, and it frightened her more than any lie could have. "Who are you?" she asked, very quietly, as the music began to slow toward its final measures. "Someone who is about to become considerably more complicated to know," he said, "and who very much hopes you will not hold that complication against him when the truth of it finally arrives." The dance ended before she could ask what he meant, and before she could press further, a stir at the ballroom's grand entrance drew every eye in the room, including, at last, her own. 3 men in unfamiliar livery stood at the doors, travel-worn and formal, and the eldest of them announced, in a voice pitched to carry across the entire glittering room, words that emptied the color from Eleanora's face and turned every head toward the man who had, a moment before, been holding her hand. His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Alaric of Verranmore. The silence that followed was the particular silence of 100 people recalculating, in the space of one breath, everything they thought they had understood about the evening. Eleanora did not move. She could not. The floor beneath her felt suddenly unfamiliar, as though the room itself had shifted its shape around her. She looked at the man beside her, at Nathaniel Hart, at the groundsman who mended trellises and calmed frightened animals, and spoke to her as though her opinion mattered more than anyone else's in the house, and saw, for the first time, the truth that had been standing directly in front of her for 6 weeks. He was watching her face with an expression of such careful dread that she understood, in that instant, precisely how much this moment had cost him to arrange, and precisely how much it might now cost him to lose her because of it. "Alaric," she said, testing the name the way one tests ice before trusting one's full weight to it. "Not Nathaniel." "Nathaniel Hart does not exist," he said quietly, for her ears alone, while the rest of the room began its low, urgent murmur of shock and speculation and the particular hunger of watching a scandal unfold in real time. "He was a man I invented so that I might, for once in my life, be looked at without a crown between myself and the person looking. I did not invent him to deceive you, Eleanora. I invented him so that when someone finally saw me, truly saw me, I would know it was the man, and not the throne, that had earned it." "And did it work?" Her voice was not steady now, and she did not try to make it so. "It worked entirely too well," he said, and something in his eyes was raw in a way she had not seen there before. "I came to Hertfordshire, meaning to disappear for a season, and decide, in quiet, what sort of life I actually wanted. I did not come meaning to fall in love with a woman mending linens in her aunt's house. But I find I have very little choice left in the matter, and considerably less regret about it than I expected to feel." Across the ballroom, Lady Prescott had gone the color of old parchment, and Charlotte's mouth had fallen open in a manner entirely unbecoming a young lady hoping to catch a husband's eye. The whole assembled company had begun, with the terrible efficiency of the aristocracy, to reorganize its understanding of who in this house had been worth cultivating all along, and who had wasted 11 months failing to notice it. But Eleanora was not thinking of Charlotte, or Lady Prescott, or the sudden ravenous attention of a room that had ignored her for the length of an entire season, and now could not look away. She was thinking only of a man who had watched her calm a frightened horse, and decided, in that quiet, unwitnessed moment, that she was the truest thing he had found in a life built almost entirely of performance. "You should have told me," she said, though there was no true anger in it, only the ache of having been, for 6 weeks, both entirely known and entirely deceived. "I know," he said, "and I will spend considerably longer than this one evening making that right, if you will permit me the chance to try. But I could not tell you sooner, Eleanora, because I needed, selfishly, perhaps unforgivably, to know first whether you could ever have looked at me the way you looked at that frightened horse, as something worth patience, worth understanding, worth kindness that asked for nothing in return. Around them, the orchestra had faltered into uncertain silence, and the entire ballroom stood suspended in the particular hush that precedes a scandal or a miracle, no one quite certain yet which this evening would prove to be. It was into that hush that Lady Prescott, recovering her voice before anyone else recovered theirs, stepped forward with the practiced smile of a woman salvaging a catastrophe. "Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice pitched too loud, too bright, "what an extraordinary honor you do our household. My daughter Charlotte has spoken of nothing but the pleasure of tonight's ball for a fortnight." "I did not come to Ashcombe Hall for your daughter, Lady Prescott," Alaric said, and though his voice remained perfectly courteous, there was steel beneath it now, the unmistakable authority of a man who had spent his whole life learning precisely how to end a conversation without raising his voice. "I came, initially, to disappear from a life that had grown unbearably hollow. I remained these 6 weeks because I found, in your household, the one person who never once asked what I was worth, only what sort of man I was. I would be obliged if the distinction were remembered." Lady Prescott's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Charlotte's face had gone from shock to something considerably uglier, though she had the sense, at least, to say nothing in so public a room. "Your niece," Alaric continued, turning fully now toward Eleanora, and reaching for her hand in a gesture that was suddenly, unmistakably formal, "has spent 11 months in this house, being treated as though her presence were a debt to be tolerated, rather than a gift to be valued. I have watched her mend linens with more grace than most women bring to a ballroom. I have watched her comfort a frightened animal with more patience than most physicians bring to a suffering patient. I have watched her endure smallness and unkindness with a dignity that never once curdled into bitterness, though she had every reason in the world to let it." His hand tightened, very gently, around hers. "I do not know yet what sort of prince I will make, Eleanora. I left Verranmore uncertain whether I wanted the crown at all, but I know, with a certainty I have found nowhere else in my life, precisely what sort of wife I want beside me when I finally take it up. If you will have me, not Nathaniel Hart, who was only ever a borrowed name, but Alaric, who is considerably more complicated and considerably less deserving of you than he would like to be, I will spend the whole of my life making certain you never again sit at the edge of a room wondering whether you are wanted." The ballroom held its breath. Eleanora felt every eye in the room upon her, felt the weight of 100 whispered speculations, felt Charlotte's fury and Lady Prescott's calculation and the particular hunger of an aristocracy watching a fortune shift before their eyes. But none of it mattered in the end, half so much as the steady, waiting warmth in the eyes of the man before her, the same warmth that had caught her at the elbow by a rose trellis, that had watched her through a stable door with quiet, careful reverence, that had called her worth watching over before he had any right to make such a claim. "You let me think you were only a groundsman," she said softly, "and yet you were the only person in this house who ever treated me as though I were more than a poor relation, earning her keep. I do not know how to reconcile the deception with the kindness, Alaric, but I find, when I try to imagine refusing you, that I cannot manage it. Not truly, not when every instinct in me says the man who caught me by that trellis was never pretending at all, that the kindness was the truth, and the title was only ever the thing he had to hide to let me see it." "Then let me hide nothing further," he said, "and let the whole room hear it as I say it. I choose you, Eleanora Whitfield. Not as a convenience of circumstance, not as a curiosity discovered in an unlikely house, but as the truest thing I have found in a life spent surrounded by people who wanted only what I could give them. I choose you because you never once wanted anything from me at all, and that, I have come to understand, is the rarest gift a man in my position will ever be offered." She did not need to look at Charlotte's stricken face, or Lady Prescott's furious calculation, or the assembled company already reordering itself around this astonishing new arithmetic of worth. She looked only at Alaric, at the steady dark eyes that had watched her for 6 quiet weeks, and found, in her ordinary kindnesses, something he had travelled a very great distance to find. "Yes," she said, and the word carried through the hush of the ballroom like the first note of a new and better song. "Yes, Alaric, I will have you, the groundsman and the prince both, and whatever complicated, uncertain man exists somewhere between the two of them." The morning after the ball, before the household had fully recovered its composure, or its gossip had settled into its final shape, Alaric came to Ashcombe Hall not as a groundsman slipping quietly through a side door, but as a prince arriving properly, by the front entrance, with his small retinue of envoys standing at careful attention behind him. He asked, with the particular formality that Eleanora would come to learn he reserved for matters he considered sacred, for a private audience with her, not with Lady Prescott, not with the family solicitor, but with Eleanora alone, so that whatever passed between them in that hour would belong entirely to the two of them, and to no one else's account of the evening. They spoke, that morning, in the same walled kitchen garden where she had once wept over her father's ruined inheritance without knowing she was heard. He told her, fully now, all that Nathaniel Hart had only gestured toward, the restless unhappiness of a life spent as an object of political calculation rather than a man known for himself, the particular loneliness of a prince, surrounded always by people who wanted something from him, the desperate, half-formed hope with which he had ridden away from Verranmore 6 weeks earlier, uncertain whether he was fleeing a life he did not want, or searching for one he had not yet found. "I did not know, when I arrived here, that I was searching for you specifically," he admitted, standing among the same cold cabbage rows where she had once believed herself entirely alone. "I only knew that I wanted, for once, to be looked at plainly, without the weight of a crown standing between myself and whoever was doing the looking. I did not expect that the person who finally looked at me that way would also be the person hiding her own considerable worth beneath 11 months of quiet mistreatment. I think, in truth, we found each other because we were both practicing the same small, stubborn art of surviving somewhere we were not fully valued." "And now?" she asked, though she already knew, from the steadiness in his eyes, precisely what his answer would be. "Now, I intend to spend the whole of my life making certain you are valued exactly as thoroughly as you deserve," he said. "In every room you ever enter again, beginning with this one, and ending, I hope, in whatever rooms we come to share as husband and wife." What followed in the weeks after was, by the standards of Ashcombe Hall's usual gossip, a scandal of the most delicious variety. A poor relation raised overnight to a prince's chosen bride, a household forced to reckon with 11 months of unkindness, now paraded before the very society that had witnessed it. Lady Prescott discovered, to her considerable discomfort, that a princess did not forget who had handed her a too small gown as an afterthought, though Eleanora, true to the character that had won her a crown, chose grace over vengeance, and extended toward her aunt a courtesy that was, in its own quiet way, a far sharper reminder of the distance between them than cruelty could ever have managed. Charlotte, for her part, took considerably longer to recover her equilibrium, having spent 11 months believing herself the sun around which the household's every hope revolved, only to discover that the quiet cousin mending linens in the corner had been the truer treasure all along. It was, Eleanora reflected privately, its own kind of justice, not the loud, satisfying vengeance that a lesser woman might have craved, but the far quieter satisfaction of simply being, at last, undeniably seen. Mr. Barrow, informed with careful diplomacy that Miss Whitfield's future had been settled in a direction considerably beyond his own modest prospects, withdrew his interest in the household entirely within the fortnight, and Eleanora found she could not summon even a moment's regret at the loss of a suitor she had never once wanted. Alaric's envoys, when they finally caught up with him in full, found a prince considerably changed from the restless, uncertain man who had vanished from Verranmore 6 weeks before, steadied now, and certain, in a way that had nothing to do with the crown he would eventually take up, and everything to do with the woman who would stand beside him when he did. The months between the ball and the wedding were not without their difficulties. Verranmore's court, accustomed to arranging its princes' marriages with the same careful calculation Lady Prescott had once hoped to apply to Eleanora's own future, did not receive the news of an English gentlewoman's sudden elevation with universal warmth. There were ministers who murmured about suitable alliances lost, and elderly courtiers who wondered aloud whether a woman raised mending linens could truly be prepared for the weight of a crown, and at least one distant cousin of the royal house who made no secret of believing herself considerably better suited to the position Eleanora now occupied. Alaric met each of these objections not with argument, but with the same quiet, unshakable certainty he had first shown her in the stable, watching her calm a frightened horse. He brought her to Verranmore a full season before the wedding, not to parade her before the court as a curiosity to be judged, but to give her time to learn the shape of the life she was choosing, and to give the court time to see, gradually and undeniably, precisely what he had seen in that Hertfordshire garden. She won them slowly, as she had always won people, not through grand gestures or practiced charm, but through the same unhurried attentiveness that had first caught a lonely prince's notice. She learned the names of every servant in the palace within a month, and troubled herself to ask after their families with a sincerity that no one in that gilded, transactional court had ever quite offered them before. She sat with the old Dowager Duchess, whom everyone else found impossibly difficult, and discovered beneath the woman's brittle formality a grief for a husband 3 decades dead that no one had thought to acknowledge in years. She managed, within that single season, to become beloved by exactly the sort of overlooked people whom a more ambitious woman might have considered beneath her notice, and in doing so, she taught an entire skeptical court the same lesson Alaric had learned first and most thoroughly of all, that her worth had never been a matter of birth or dowry, but of the steady, unglamorous goodness she brought to every room she entered, whether anyone of consequence was watching or not. They were married in the spring, in a ceremony considerably grander than anything Ashcombe Hall's ballroom could have staged, though Eleanora insisted, and Alaric readily agreed, that the rose trellis where he had first caught her by the elbow be transplanted, root and stone, to the gardens of their new home, a small, stubborn insistence on remembering exactly where the truest part of their story had actually begun. She wore, beneath the formal splendor of her wedding gown, a narrow ribbon of cornflower blue silk, cut from her mother's old dress and stitched carefully into the hem where no one else would ever see it. A private thread connecting the poor relation who had once believed herself unwanted to the princess she had somehow, impossibly, become. Alaric noticed it anyway, when she told him of it that evening, and said only that he was glad some part of the woman who had first caught his notice would always be woven, however invisibly, into every grand and glittering version of her still to come. Lady Prescott and Charlotte attended the wedding, seated with careful ceremony near enough the front to satisfy propriety, and far enough back to remind them, gently but unmistakably, of the true shape of the household's hierarchy now. Eleanora had considered, briefly, denying them the invitation altogether, and had decided against it, not from any lingering desire for their approval, but because she found, examining her own heart in the quiet days before the ceremony, that she no longer needed their good opinion to know her own worth, and that this certainty was, in itself, a far greater victory than any exclusion could have offered her. Mrs. Kellow, the Ashcombe housekeeper, whose suspicions had once unsettled her so deeply, received a personal letter from the new princess some months later. Not a reprimand for the gossip once whispered in the servants' hall, but a simple note of thanks for having, however inadvertently, prepared Eleanora's heart for a truth she might otherwise have received with far greater shock. Mrs. Kellow kept that letter, folded carefully, for the rest of her days, and told the story of the groundsman prince to every new housemaid who came through Ashcombe Hall's doors, always ending it the same way, that a woman's worth was never determined by the room she was seated in, but by the quality of attention she brought to whoever needed it, whether a frightened horse, a grieving dowager, or a lonely prince pretending, for one strange golden season, to be nothing more than an ordinary man. And in the quiet evenings that followed, when the business of a court and a crown had settled into its long, patient rhythm, Alaric would sometimes find his wife in the stables, speaking low and steady to some frightened, overlooked creature that needed nothing more than patience and a gentle hand to understand it was finally, entirely safe. He would watch her from the doorway, the way he had watched her that very first time, and think, with a certainty that had never once wavered since, that he had traveled the length of a kingdom and given up an entire name to find the one person alive who could look at him and see, before anything else, simply a man worth loving. There were, in the years that followed, grander occasions than that first quiet garden encounter. Coronations, state visits, the birth of children who would grow up hearing the story of how their parents had first met, embellished a little more with each retelling, though the essential truth of it never changed. But Eleanora found that her favorite hours remained, always the quietest ones. Early mornings in the palace gardens before the rest of the household stirred, evenings by the fire when the crown could be set aside and only the man remained. The particular peace of being known completely by someone who had first loved her, without any of the trappings that now surrounded them both. She would think, sometimes, of the girl who had once folded herself small in a corner of Ashcombe Hall's ballroom, certain that invisibility was the safest shape a woman in her position could take. She did not regret that girl exactly. She understood now that the careful, quiet dignity she had practiced through 11 difficult months had been its own kind of strength. Not a weakness to be outgrown, but a foundation the rest of her life had been built upon. It was that same quiet dignity, after all, that had first caught the attention of a lonely, disguised prince standing at the edge of a rose trellis, and it was that same steadiness that had carried her, one patient season at a time, into a life she had never once dared to imagine for herself. Alaric, for his part, would sometimes tell their children, in the unguarded hours before sleep, that the truest lesson a prince could ever learn was not found in any of his tutor's lessons on statecraft or diplomacy, but in a Hertfordshire stable, watching a woman in a borrowed shawl calm a frightened horse with nothing but patience and an unhurried voice. He had gone looking, in those 6 strange weeks of borrowed anonymity, for a version of himself that existed apart from his crown. He had found, instead, something far better, a woman who had taught him that the crown was never the point at all, and that the truest measure of any man, prince or groundsman alike, was simply the quality of attention he was willing to give to whoever the world had taught him not to notice. She never again sat at the edge of a room wondering whether she was wanted, and he, in turn, never again wondered whether a crown was the truest measure of a man's worth, because she had shown him, in 100 small, unwitnessed kindnesses, that it had never been the measure at all.